One of the most unsettling cases to cross the desk of Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross in the summer of 1990 at her Arizona residence didn't originate in an American hospital bed. It wasn't drawn from the reports of terminally ill patients she'd spent decades alongside in the halls of the University of Chicago or the wards of Charlottesville Hospital. Instead, the envelope arrived through regular mail sent by the University of Virginia. It was postmarked, heavy, and contained documents that were about to challenge not only her understanding of the continuity of human consciousness, but the entire methodical framework she had built over 40 years of clinical practice. The sender was Dr. Ian Stevenson, a Canadian psychiatrist and full professor in the university's Department of Psychiatry. Stevenson's academic reputation was forged in terrain as controversial as it was fascinating. The systematic investigation of cases where children claimed to remember previous lives with verifiable accuracy. Dr. Kübler-Ross opened the envelope at her rustic wooden table, surrounded by the dry mountains framing her Tucson property. At 64, she maintained the same meticulous attitude that had defined her in medical circles. The contents included a copy of an as-yet unpublished scientific article by Canadian anthropologist Antonia Mills, a yellowed clipping from the India Today magazine dated December 31, 1988, and black and white photographs of a frail-looking Indian boy with large dark eyes that seemed to carry a seriousness inappropriate for his young age. Stevenson's introductory letter was characteristically sober, but one sentence immediately grabbed her attention. This may be the most remarkable case of psychophysical correspondence ever documented in our literature, with a verifiable match between birthmarks and fatal injuries, in addition to prior statements later confirmed with unusual precision. Kübler-Ross had been familiar with Stevenson's work since the 70s. Her own career was devoted to studying death and the dying process, documenting the psychological stages terminally ill patients went through and interviewing thousands of people who had experienced temporary clinical death. However, Stevenson's cases presented something different. These weren't memories of experiences during death, but memories that crossed over death, carried from one life to the next, across the chasm, separating an ending from a new beginning. Antonia Mills' article began with the descriptive precision of an ethnographic report, establishing geographical and temporal coordinates before diving into the narrative. On August 28, 1983, in the city of Agra, Uttar Pradesh, North India, an electronics merchant named Suresh Verma was murdered under circumstances described in police records with bureaucratic coldness. 2 shots from a firearm. The first struck his right temple and exited the posterior region of his left ear. The second lodged in his chest. Suresh Verma was 35 years old, married to Uma Verma, a father of 2 small children, and the owner of a shop called Suresh Radio. His body was taken to the local hospital, where death was officially pronounced at 7:42 p.m. that August evening. Uma Verma buried her husband according to traditional Hindu rites, left as a widow with 2 children. Approximately 4 months after the murder, on December 10, 1983, a boy was born in the village of Bod, about 60 kilometers from Agra. He was named Toran Singh, though he would become known by the nickname Titu. The Singh family had no known connection to the Verma family, did not conduct business in Agra, and Titu's parents had never known Suresh Verma during his lifetime. For the first few years, the boy developed normally, began speaking around age 2, and displayed typical childhood curiosity. But something started changing when Titu turned about 3 years old. Dr. Kübler-Ross paused, looking out at the desert landscape outside her window. She knew the methodical terrain she was entering, the tension between the extraordinary account and the need for rigorous scrutiny. Throughout her decades working with the terminally ill at Billings Hospital in Chicago and later at the University of Chicago, she had developed a careful protocol for documenting near-death experiences, NDEs. always questioning possible neurological explanations, cultural influences, and psychological projections. Now, she faced an even more challenging phenomenon: a child claiming to be someone who had died before he was born. Mills's article described how around 1986, when Titu was about 3, he began making strange statements that deeply worried his parents. At mealtimes, he'd reject certain foods, claiming, "My wife made it differently at my other house." Titu insisted he had a wife named Uma and 2 children, that he lived in a house near a radio shop. His parents initially dismissed these claims as childish fantasies, but their consistency and level of detail began to alarm them. The boy described the Agra house with startling accuracy: painted white with blue accents, a front porch, and located near a specific temple. He spoke about the business, Suresh Radio, mentioning specific types of equipment he sold, describing the furniture arrangement, and even details about suppliers he did business with. But most disturbing were his statements about his own death. Titu repeatedly claimed, "Bad men shot me," touching the right side of his head and his chest area, the precise locations where Suresh Verma received the fatal shots. He would cry when talking about it, displaying a disproportionate fear for a child who had never experienced physical violence. At night, he would wake up screaming, claiming, "The men are coming back." The Singh family consulted the village elders, who suggested the child might be tormented by memories of a past life. Titu's mother, a simple woman with no formal education, began writing her son's statements in a school notebook, unknowingly creating an invaluable document for future scientific investigation. Mills reported that the Singh family hesitated for over a year before deciding to investigate whether there was any truth to the child's claims. The trip to Agra represented a significant expense for a rural family of modest means, but the boy's insistence became unbearable. He pleaded to visit his wife, crying and begging to see his children. In 1987, when Titu was about 4, his father decided to make the journey. Crucially, as Mills emphasized in the article, the family had no prior knowledge of Suresh Verma or his family, relying entirely on the directions Titu himself would give. The description of their arrival in Agra had the cinematic quality of great documentary moments. The Singh family arrived in the city by train and walked through the busy streets, with Titu pointing the way with surprising confidence. "Turn here," he would say. "The shop is past that temple. My house has a blue porch." They eventually reached a residential neighborhood where there was indeed a shop with a Suresh Radio sign, already run by other owners. Nearby, Titu pointed to a specific house, painted white with blue details, just as he had described. A woman was standing on the porch, Uma Verma, watching the approaching family of strangers with suspicion. Titu looked at Uma Verma and, according to several independent witnesses, said in a clear voice, "Uma, why did you change the porch color? I liked it the way it was before." Uma Verma froze. The porch had been painted green years before, during Suresh's lifetime, and had only been repainted blue after his death. This was not public knowledge. When Titu's father explained the circumstances, Uma Verma was initially skeptical, but agreed to ask the boy targeted questions. Titu answered one question after another correctly. He knew where Suresh kept important documents, recalled a specific discussion about expanding the business, precisely described a scar Suresh had on his leg since childhood, and named the family dog that had died years earlier. But the moment that shook Uma Verma the most was when Titu asked to see his children. The 2 children were called, and the boy from Bod looked at them with an expression witnesses described as a mixture of joy and deep melancholy. He called each by their correct name, mentioned loving nicknames only Suresh used, and recalled specific toys. The older daughter began to cry, not out of fear, but from what seemed like an instinctive recognition. Titu then began to cry as well, saying repeatedly, I miss you so much." Uma Verma, according to her own account to Mills, felt at that moment that she was facing something beyond her understanding. something her Hindu faith had always asserted was possible, yet she never expected to witness with such clarity. The news of the meeting quickly spread in the local community, attracting the attention of journalists and eventually the national Indian press. The India Today magazine sent a reporter to investigate, and the resulting article bore the provocative headline, "Died August 28, 1983, reborn December 10, 1983. For Dr. Kübler-Ross, the true value of the case was not in the media coverage, but in the systematic investigation carried out by Antonia Mills under Ian Stevenson's methodical guidance. Mills arrived in India in 1988, about a year after the families met. She brought a cassette tape recorder, a camera, notebooks, and a structured interview protocol developed by Stevenson to minimize bias. Her first step was to interview members of both families separately, recording their versions before seeking confirmation through independent sources. She spoke with neighbors, merchants who had known Suresh Verma in life, and distant relatives. Mills spent weeks in the region, meticulously documenting every aspect of the case. The result of this investigation was the identification of 46 specific statements Titu had made about Suresh Verma's life. Of these, 15 had been recorded before the families first met, documented in Titu's mother's handwritten notebook. The other 31 statements were made after the meeting, but all were subjected to independent verification. Out of the total 46 statements, 26 were confirmed as entirely correct, 12 as partially correct, and only 8 could not be verified due to lack of witnesses or documentation. No statement was definitively refuted. Dr. Kübler-Ross understood the methodological standards of past life memory research. She knew critics pointed to possibilities of conscious fraud, cryptomnesia, and retroactive construction of narratives. She had faced similar criticism in her own studies of near-death experiences. She had developed respect for Stevenson's methodology precisely because he anticipated such objections and developed protocols to minimize them, while openly acknowledging the limitations of every case studied. But there was one aspect of the Titu Singh case that went beyond the verification of verbal statements, something Mills had carefully photographed and which Stevenson referred to in his letter as the remarkable psychophysical correspondence. Kübler-Ross now examined the black and white photographs enclosed in the envelope, images showing Titu Singh's head and torso, on which circular birthmarks were clearly visible. The first mark was on the right temple, small and round, with slightly raised edges. The second mark was behind the left ear, somewhat larger, with an irregular pattern characteristic of exit wounds. A third, less defined mark appeared in the upper right chest area. The correlation was disturbing in its precision. Suresh Verma had been struck by a shot that entered the right temple and exited behind the left ear, a ballistic trajectory confirmed by the autopsy report. The second shot had hit the upper right chest. Titu's birthmarks corresponded not only to the general location of these injuries, but also to the characteristic difference between entry and exit wounds. The mark on the temple was smaller and more regular, typical of a projectile's entry, while the mark behind the ear was larger and more irregular, typical of an exit with tissue fragmentation. Mills had consulted forensic pathologists who confirmed that spontaneously reproducing these specific differences would be extraordinarily improbable. Kübler-Ross placed the photographs on the table, feeling that familiar intellectual tension between trained skepticism and an openness to possibilities that challenged conventional models of reality. In her working years at Billings Hospital and later at the University of Virginia, she had crossed paths with Stevenson a few times in academic corridors. She remembered a particular conversation, perhaps in 1976 or 77, during a symposium in Charlottesville, where Stevenson spoke about the necessity of converging evidence when investigating extraordinary claims. Verbal statements alone, no matter how numerous or precise, always allowed for alternative explanations. But when verbal statements converged with physical characteristics, when intangible memories found correspondence in bodily scars, the methodological equation changed significantly. However, Kübler-Ross's trained mind did not allow fascination to cloud critical analysis. She was well aware of the objections skeptical colleagues would raise. The first objection: statistical chance. Birthmarks are common, occurring in about 10% of newborns. Mills had preempted this objection by providing probability calculations. The occurrence of 3 circular marks in specific locations with characteristic differences between entry and exit points, corresponding precisely to a documented murder, yielded probabilities low enough to warrant serious consideration. The second objection: the possibility of conscious fraud. Mills had investigated this extensively, noting that Suresh Verma's murder had received only minimal local coverage, limited to brief mentions in Agra newspapers with no details about his personal life, which Titu later described. Furthermore, the Singh family was of modest means, with no history of fraudulent behavior, and had not sought financial compensation. Independent witnesses confirmed Titu made claims about his other life from a very young age. The third objection: cryptomnesia, the phenomenon where information unconsciously absorbed and forgotten resurfaces as seemingly original memories. But cryptomnesia usually led to vague, malleable narratives. Titu's statements maintained a remarkable consistency over time, including verifiable but obscure details that would hardly circulate in casual conversation. There was also the question of cultural influence. India had a strong tradition of belief in reincarnation. Kübler-Ross had considered similar questions in her own NDE research. Christian patients often reported encounters with Jesus or angels. Hindu patients saw deities from their pantheon. Culture filtered, shaped, and interpreted. But Mills argued that the verifiable specificity of Titu's statements went beyond mere adaptation to general cultural expectations. Dr. Kübler-Ross stood up and walked to the window framing the Arizona desert, a landscape she chose after decades in the dense urban environments of Chicago and New York. She thought of Raymond Moody, a psychiatrist she corresponded with frequently since the publication of Life After Life in 1975. Moody had faced fierce criticism from the medical community. Kübler-Ross had publicly defended him, not because she uncritically accepted all the implications of the reports, but because she recognized that consistently reported phenomena deserved serious investigation. She also thought of Kenneth Ring, a psychologist at the University of Connecticut, whose quantitative studies of NDEs in the 80s introduced a rigorous statistical methodology. Ring had shown that about 35% of people who experienced temporary clinical death reported some form of conscious experience. There was also Stanislav Grof, a Czech psychiatrist whose work with altered states of consciousness suggested that human awareness could access realms of experience that transcended the conventional limits of time, space, and individual identity. The Titu Singh case seemed to occupy a territory between these areas of research. It wasn't exactly a near-death experience, as the boy reported no memories of a transitional period between death and rebirth, but memories of the life preceding his previous death. It was something different, requiring its own category of analysis. Kübler-Ross returned to the table and opened her personal notebook. In her characteristic, small, precise handwriting, she wrote, "If consciousness survives the body's death long enough to be experienced by clinically dead patients, why might it not survive long enough to inhabit a new body? The difference lies only in duration, not in principle." But immediately after writing this sentence, she added a critical note. "Beware of logical leaps. Survival of minutes does not imply survival of months. Continuity of experience during clinical death does not imply the transmigration of identity through rebirth. Different phenomena may require different explanations." This was the discipline she had imposed on herself over 4 decades of research. Acknowledging possibilities without hastily embracing them, maintaining intellectual openness without abandoning methodical rigor. The phone rang. It was Kenneth Ring calling from Connecticut, one of their regular conversations. Kübler-Ross mentioned the case Stevenson had sent. Ring commented that cases of past life memories and NDEs might point to a common fundamental question: the relationship between consciousness and the brain. If consciousness were merely a product of neurological processes, then both experiences during clinical death and memories enduring across lives should be impossible by definition. But if consciousness had some degree of independence from the neural substrate, then both phenomena would become less inexplicable. Kübler-Ross agreed, but added her characteristic caution. NDEs occurred while some residual brain activity might still be present. Cases like T2 Singh's were different because they seemed to imply continuity over periods where no brain of the previous individual existed. Ring mentioned that some theoretical physicists speculated on the possibility that conscious information might exist at more fundamental levels of reality. Kübler-Ross replied with gentle skepticism. Quantum physics was fascinating, but its premature application to consciousness questions risked creating pseudo-explanations. After ending the call, she returned to Mill's article, reaching the sections describing the emotional and behavioral aspects of the case. T2 not only made statements about being Suresh Verma, but also exhibited behavioral patterns consistent with that identity. He insisted he liked certain foods Suresh favored. He showed an early interest in electronic equipment. Most notably, he expressed a deep emotional attachment to the Verma family, crying when he had to return to Bod after visits, and consistently referring to Uma as "my wife," despite adult corrections. Mills documented a later visit in 1989, when T2 was about 5 or 6 years old. She noted that his memories seemed to be gradually fading as the boy grew older, a phenomenon Stevenson had observed in other similar cases as well. Children who made vivid statements about previous lives between ages 2 and 5 often forgot those memories by the time they turned 7 or 8, as if the identity of the current life was progressively overwriting the previous one. This pattern of fading held a particular resonance for Kübler-Ross because it corresponded to something she herself had noted in her interviews with children who experienced temporary clinical death. As these children grew older, many completely forgot their experiences. The afternoon wore on over the Arizona desert. Kübler-Ross picked up the photographs of T2's birthmarks once more. There was something deeply unsettling about these images, not just for the philosophical implications, but for the sheer physical concreteness. Verbal statements remained in the realm of testimony, but birthmarks were anatomical facts that existed independently of narratives. If these marks truly corresponded to Suresh Verma's fatal injuries, then the phenomenon transcended questions of memory and entered the territory of how information about physical trauma could be transmitted from one body to another across the abyss of death. Stevenson had dedicated decades to the systematic study of this specific phenomenon, documenting hundreds of cases where children remembering past lives also displayed birthmarks corresponding to the injuries that caused the death of the previous person. But even Stevenson admitted in his writings that he had no satisfactory explanation for the mechanism by which such correspondence could occur. Kübler-Ross arranged the documents chronologically, creating a visual timeline. She jotted down specific questions the case raised. First question: why T2? If reincarnation was a real phenomenon, why did only a certain percentage of children manifest past life memories? Second question: why the violent death? Stevenson had noted that violent deaths were disproportionately represented among the remembered past lives. Third question: what role did the birthmarks play? How could information about injuries suffered by an adult man months earlier influence embryonic development in a genetically unrelated fetus? Kübler-Ross stood up and walked to the bookshelf where she kept her own published books. On Death and Dying from 1969, Death, the Final Stage of Growth from 1975. On Life After Death from 1981, where she began discussing the possibility of consciousness continuity beyond bodily death. But the T2 Singh case presented something beyond experiences during temporary death. It was not about consciousness persisting for minutes, but about identity enduring for months between death and rebirth. Kübler-Ross returned to the table and began drafting a letter to Stevenson on her manual typewriter. She thanked him for sending the documents, praised Mill's rigorous methodology, and commented on the questions the case raised. She mentioned wanting to cite the case at a conference she would give in Zurich in the fall. On the last page, she allowed herself to become more personal. Ian, after 40 years of studying death, I thought I understood its essential contours. But cases like this remind me that we are only just beginning to map a territory that may be infinitely larger than we assume. Cases like T2 Singh's pointed toward an even more radical possibility, that individual identity might cross the abyss of death and reappear in a new body, carrying memories and even physical marks from previous journeys. Dr. Kübler-Ross didn't claim to have definitive proof. She never asserted that science had undeniably proven reincarnation. Instead, her argument, strengthened by decades of careful observation, was that the evidence collected justified taking these possibilities seriously, that consistently reported phenomena deserved rigorous investigation instead of automatic scorn. The core question wasn't whether reincarnation was real, but whether human consciousness was a more complex and mysterious phenomenon than conventional materialistic models acknowledged. T2 Singh, growing up in a distant Indian village, would gradually forget his memories of being Suresh Verma. The birthmarks would remain, physical scars of a trauma he never consciously experienced in this life. But the memories would fade as a new identity solidified. This fading was perhaps a necessary part of the process, allowing a new life to be lived fully instead of being trapped by attachments to a previous existence. If consciousness truly persists through multiple lives, maybe forgetting was just as important as remembering to allow for renewal, to offer the chance to start over. Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross kept the documents on the case in her personal archives, filing them among other materials that marked the boundaries of her research, territories where evidence met mystery, where science reached the limits of its own grasp. She had dedicated her entire life to the study of death, bringing scientific light to a process modern society preferred to avoid. Her legacy would be a transformation in how medicine and society treated the terminally ill, recognizing that dying was an integral part of human life that deserved care, dignity, and serious attention. But in her personal files, in conversations with close colleagues, she also carried larger questions about the nature of consciousness and the possibility that death was not an end, but a transition. The Arizona desert sun continued its journey across the sky, casting long shadows onto the table where she worked, onto the documents recording the story of a boy who remembered being a murdered merchant, onto the photographs of birthmarks that corresponded to fatal injuries. She closed her personal notebook and looked toward the distant mountains, thinking of all the patients she had guided through the dying process, all the stories she had heard, and all the mysteries that remained unsolved despite decades of inquiry. Death, she had learned, did not yield its secrets easily. But every carefully documented case, every observation recorded with rigor, every connection drawn between seemingly disparate phenomena, contributed to a gradual understanding of a territory that would always remain partly dark, always inviting further exploration. And perhaps that's how it should be. Perhaps the greatest mysteries of human existence are not meant to be fully solved, but only gradually approached, studied with intellectual humility, addressed with awe for what we still don't know. The T2 Singh case would remain a testament that reality could be stranger and more wonderful than conventional theories allowed, that human consciousness might transcend boundaries that seemed absolute, that death and birth could be interwoven threads in the same continuous fabric of existence. If you've made it this far on this journey through one of the most extraordinary cases documented by Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, you're part of a growing community of people trying to understand the deepest secrets of human existence. This knowledge shouldn't remain isolated. Transformation happens when we share discoveries that challenge our conventional understanding of reality, when we build bridges between rigorous science and ancient questions about consciousness, death, and continuity. Subscribe to this channel to continue exploring documented cases that sit on the boundary between the known and the inexplicable. Investigations conducted with scientific methodology into phenomena that conventional science often ignores. Leave a comment and tell us what city you're watching from, creating a global map of people connected by this shared search for understanding. And consider sending this content to friends, family members, or colleagues who are also asking questions about the nature of consciousness and the possibility that death is not an end, but a transition. Every person who joins this stream of knowledge strengthens a network of collective inquiry where healthy skepticism meets genuine openness, where methodical rigor does not exclude the possibility of wonder. Together, we are building a community based not on dogma or blind faith, but on scientific curiosity applied to the most fundamental questions of the human experience. Your participation transforms this exploration from a solitary activity into a collective dialogue, where every perspective contributes to a richer, more nuanced understanding of the mysteries we face when we encounter the reality of death and the possibility of continuity beyond it. We'll see you in the next investigation, where we'll continue to follow the evidence wherever it leads, always maintaining that delicate balance between necessary skepticism and courageous openness to possibilities that challenge conventional frameworks of thought.